The word Viking conjures images of wild raids and roaring warriors, but behind every sword raised and sail unfurled were leaders, visionaries, warlords, kings, who carved their names into the stone of history. From the icy fjords of Norway to the green coasts of England and the distant shores of North America, these are the 6 Viking leaders you should know. Let's begin. He was too large for horses, too wild for kings, and too ambitious for the narrow fjords of his homeland. They called him Hrolfr the Walker, but history remembers him as Rollo, the Viking who traded his sword for a crown and founded one of medieval Europe's most powerful dynasties. Rollo was born around the mid-9th century, likely in Norway, though some accounts claim Denmark. His real Norse name was Hrolfr, and legend says he was so immense in size that no horse could carry him, thus the nickname Walker. He came from a noble family. His father, Rognvald Eysteinsson, was a powerful earl, and his younger brothers would also go on to achieve fame. Rollo was raised like many sons of Norse chieftains, trained in sailing, combat, and the brutal art of survival in a world ruled by strength. But his fate would not be to serve another. Like many Vikings of his time, Rollo turned his eyes south, not just to raid, but to build. In the late 800s, Rollo began leading raids along the coasts of modern-day France. Fierce and relentless, his warriors burned and plundered deep into Frankish territory, especially along the Seine River. But it wasn't just gold he wanted, it was land, a place to settle, a future. In 885 AD, Rollo was part of the massive Viking siege of Paris, a battle that lasted over a year. While they didn't take the city then, the Viking presence in Francia was now impossible to ignore. The Frankish kings had tried and failed to expel the Norse. By 911 AD, Charles the Simple, king of West Francia, was desperate, so he offered Rollo a deal, land, in exchange for peace. Rollo agreed. He was baptised as a Christian, took the name Robert, and swore loyalty to the Frankish crown. In return, he was granted a stretch of land along the Seine, a buffer zone to protect against other Viking invaders. That land would become known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Rollo was no longer a raider, he was a duke, and he ruled with fierce authority. He encouraged his Norse followers to settle, farm, and marry into the local Frankish population. Over time, the Viking language faded, replaced by Old French. But the warrior spirit remained. Rollo established laws, protected trade, and secured his borders. He laid the foundation for a new kind of Norse identity, one not defined by pillage, but by power and permanence. And his bloodline, it would go on to shape history. Rollo's descendants ruled Normandy for generations, but his most famous heir came nearly a century later, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, and eventual King of England. In 1066, William invaded England and won the Battle of Hastings, changing the English language, nobility, and law forever. All of it began with Rollo, the giant who walked from exile to empire. He died around 930 AD, likely in Rouen, having secured a legacy few Vikings could dream of. From outlaw to noble, from sea raider to statesman, Rollo's story is not just a tale of war. It is the story of transformation, of a man who turned violence into vision and carved a kingdom from chaos. Rollo, the Viking who became a duke and the father of a dynasty. His name struck fear and curiosity across the North Atlantic. Erik the Red wasn't just a warrior or an explorer, he was an exile who carved a colony from ice and gave the world one of the boldest Viking tales ever told. This is the story of the man who founded Greenland's first Norse settlement and reshaped the Viking frontier. Erik Thorvaldsson was born around 950 AD in Rogaland, Norway. His father, Thorvald Asvaldsson, was banished from the country for murder, a stain that would follow Erik his entire life. The family fled west to Iceland, then a wild new frontier for Norse settlers. Erik was raised in harsh conditions, learning to fight, farm, and survive on the edges of the known world. But violence ran in his blood. Like his father, Erik found himself at the centre of deadly feuds. Around 980 AD, after killing a man in a land dispute, Erik was exiled, again, for 3 years. But he wouldn't sit idle. Instead, Erik turned his gaze farther west, into the unknown. Sailing beyond the reach of Iceland, Erik set off into uncharted waters. He had heard rumours from earlier explorers like Gunnbjörn Ulfsson of land far to the west, land glimpsed through fog and storm. What he found was a harsh, icy coastline with pockets of habitable fjords. It wasn't lush, but it had potential. He called it Greenland. Why, Erik was no fool. He chose the name to attract settlers. People will be more eager to go there, he reportedly said, if it has a good name. After exploring and mapping the coast, Erik returned to Iceland to spread word of his discovery. When his exile ended, he recruited settlers, men and women, farmers and warriors, and in 985 AD, a fleet of 25 ships set sail for the new land. Only 14 made it. The journey was deadly, but those who survived became the founders of the first Norse colony in Greenland. Erik established his estate in a place he called Brattahlid, near present-day Qasiasuk, in southern Greenland. There he became the unofficial chieftain of the colony, a leader not just by strength, but by boldness. The colony was isolated and brutal, but it survived. Norse settlers brought sheep, goats and cattle. They grew barley, built churches, and held fast through the long Arctic winters. Erik himself refused to convert to Christianity, even when his wife Theodhild built the first church in Greenland. He remained faithful to the old gods, a symbol of the stubborn, pagan spirit of early Viking explorers. Though never a king in title, Erik the Red ruled with authority. He led explorations, settled disputes, and held the respect of the scattered Greenlandic families. Erik's greatest legacy wasn't just Greenland, it was what came next. Through his son, Leif Erikson. Leif, born in Greenland, would hear tales of land even farther west. He would sail beyond his father's frontier and become the first European to reach North America. But none of that would have been possible without Erik's daring vision. Erik the Red turned exile into empire, forging a colony on the edge of the world that lasted for nearly 500 years. He died sometime after 1003 AD, likely during a rough Greenland winter. His bones were buried in the land he named and claimed. Long before Columbus ever dreamed of crossing the Atlantic, a Viking had already done it. Leif Erikson, son of an outlaw, born on the edge of the known world, was the first European to set foot on the shores of North America. His journey changed the map of human history, even if it was forgotten for centuries. This is the story of Leif the Lucky, explorer, settler, and the man who reached the New World 500 years early. Leif Erikson was born around 970 AD in Greenland. His family had already crossed multiple frontiers, first banished from Norway, then exiled again from Iceland. His family founded the first Norse settlement in Greenland, a land of ice, danger, and survival. There were no kings here, no cities, only the sea, the wind, and the will to endure. From an early age, Leif was trained to sail, hunt, and fight. But he also inherited something deeper from his father, a thirst for discovery and defiance. While his mother Theodhild embraced Christianity, his father remained loyal to the old gods. Leif would grow up between two worlds, one of Thor and Odin, the other of Christ and the cross. As a young man, Leif journeyed to Norway, where he entered the service of King Olaf Tryggvason, the man who had Christianized the kingdom through force and fire. Leif converted to Christianity during his time there, and was tasked by Olaf with spreading the faith back to Greenland. But fate had something bigger in store. On his return voyage, Leif was told a remarkable tale. A sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson had sighted strange new lands to the west, but never landed. Leif decided to finish what Bjarni started. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif set out into the North Atlantic with a crew of about 35 men. They first came to a rocky place he named Helluland, probably Baffin Island, then Markland with its thick forests, likely Labrador. Finally, they found a lush, fertile region with wild grapes and salmon-rich rivers. Leif called it Vinland. Modern historians believe this was somewhere in Newfoundland, Canada. There, Leif and his crew built shelters and spent the winter, the first known Europeans to establish a base in the Americas. Though the settlement was short-lived, Leif's achievement was monumental. He had crossed the Atlantic centuries before the age of Columbus and Cabot. And yet, his story was nearly lost to time. After his expedition, Leif returned to Greenland carrying timber, stories, and a new sense of destiny. When his father Erik the Red died, Leif assumed leadership of the family estate in Brattahlid. Though he never claimed the title of king, he became a powerful figure in Greenland, guiding both faith and settlement. He built a Christian church, converted settlers, and governed his people with calm authority. His nickname, Leif the Lucky, came not just from his survival, but from the belief that fate was on his side. He never returned to Vinland, and future expeditions faced resistance from native peoples. But the memory of his journey lived on in Norse sagas. Leif Eriksson's voyage was forgotten by much of the world for centuries, overshadowed by Columbus's journey in 1492. But today we know the truth. The first European to set foot in North America wasn't a Spaniard. It was a Viking. Olaf Tryggvason was more than a Viking king. He was a man on a mission, and his mission was nothing less than to change the soul of Norway. Olaf was born around 960 AD, the great-grandson of King Harald Fairhair, Norway's first unifier. But his royal blood brought no safety. When Olaf was just a baby, his father Tryggve Olafsson was murdered by rivals. His mother, Astrid, fled with him across Scandinavia, eventually reaching safety in the east. Olaf spent much of his early life in Novgorod, in modern-day Russia. There he was raised among Slavs, learning not only the way of the sword, but the art of survival in foreign courts. By the time he was a teenager, Olaf was a hardened warrior, serving as a mercenary, raider, and sailor. He fought across the Baltic, England, and Ireland, gathering experience, wealth, and purpose. Olaf's path changed forever in England. While raiding along the Thames, he encountered Christian missionaries. Whether it was guilt, strategy, or spiritual revelation, Olaf accepted the new faith and was baptized into Christianity. But Olaf wasn't content to simply convert. He saw in Christianity a tool, not just for salvation, but for unification. And he believed that Norway needed both. He returned to Scandinavia with a new vision, to take the throne of Norway, and to convert his homeland no matter the cost. In 995 AD, Olaf landed in Norway at a time of chaos. The country was divided, ruled by regional jarls and petty kings. The old gods still held sway. But he moved quickly. With the backing of discontented nobles and Christian allies, he defeated his enemies and was proclaimed King of Norway. Now Olaf held the sword, and he would use it to bring the cross. Olaf's rule was relentless and controversial. He travelled across Norway, destroying pagan temples, toppling idols, and forcing conversions. Entire regions were baptized, some willingly, others under threat of death. Chieftains who resisted were exiled or executed. He built churches, imported priests, and made Christianity the official religion of Norway. To some, he was a visionary and a saint. To others, a tyrant who betrayed Norse traditions. By the year 1000, Norway had become a Christian kingdom. One man's will had changed the religious landscape of an entire nation. Knut the Great was no ordinary Norse king. He was a diplomat, a unifier, and for a brief moment the most powerful man in Northern Europe. Knut was born around 990 AD, the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, and a Polish princess, linking him to powerful bloodlines on both sides. Little is known about his early childhood, but he was almost certainly raised in the warrior traditions of the Norse. From a young age, Knut trained in combat, sailing, and the art of kingship, watching as his father launched raids and built alliances across the North Sea. By the time Knut came of age, his destiny was clear. He would follow in his father's footsteps, not just as a warrior, but as a ruler. In 1013, Knut joined his father in invading England, a land long targeted by Viking raids. Sweyn Forkbeard briefly seized the English throne, but died suddenly in 1014, leaving Knut to lead the Danish army. The English rebelled, crowning Edmund Ironside as king. But Knut wasn't done. He returned with reinforcements, launching a brutal campaign of conquest. The two kings clashed in a series of battles, culminating in the Battle of Assanden in 1016. Knut emerged victorious. A treaty was signed. Edmund would rule the south, Knut the north. But just weeks later, Edmund died, and Knut became king of all England. At just 20 years old, he held a throne once thought impossible for a Viking. But Knut didn't stop at conquest. He became a ruler, not just of England, but of an empire. By 1028, he ruled England, Denmark and Norway, and exerted influence over parts of Sweden. Historians call it the North Sea Empire. Unlike many Viking rulers, Knut embraced Christianity and English traditions. He restored churches, upheld Anglo-Saxon law, and even made a pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 to show his devotion and secure ties with the Pope. He ruled through diplomacy as much as strength, marrying Emma of Normandy, the widow of the English king Ethelred, to solidify his legitimacy. Knut was respected not only as a conqueror, but as a statesman. One of the most famous tales about Knut isn't about war, but humility. It's said he placed his throne by the sea and commanded the waves to halt, proving to his flattering courtiers that no king, no matter how powerful, could defy the laws of nature. This story, whether literal or legend, showed a deeper truth about Knut. He understood the limits of power and the importance of wisdom. Knut ruled until his death in 1035, maintaining peace across his empire, but his sons lacked his strength and vision. Within a decade, his empire fractured. By 1042, the Anglo-Saxon line was restored, and the Viking Age in England began to fade. Yet Knut's legacy endures. He was the only Viking king to successfully rule all of England, and to govern with fairness, diplomacy, and lasting stability. Knut the Great wasn't just a king by blood. He earned his place in history through conquest, rule, and wisdom. A warrior, a builder, a ruler of kings. This was Knut the Great, England's Viking king. He fought in the burning sands of Jerusalem. He led warriors in the palaces of Byzantium, and he died swinging his sword in the last great Viking invasion of England. Harald Hardrada was the final roar of the Viking Age, a king forged in exile, fire and ambition. Harald Sigurdsson was born in 1015 in Norway, a half-brother to King Olaf II, later known as Saint Olaf. He grew up in a kingdom torn by war and rebellion. By the age of 15, Harald joined his brother's army in a fight to reclaim Norway from Danish control. That fight ended in tragedy. At the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, Olaf was killed, and young Harald barely escaped with his life. Wounded and on the run, he fled east into the lands of the Rus, and then south to the greatest empire of the age, Byzantium. In Constantinople, Harald joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Viking warriors who served as personal bodyguards to the Byzantine emperor. For nearly a decade, Harald fought across the Mediterranean, from Sicily to the Holy Land. He crushed revolts, hunted pirates, and even battled in Jerusalem. By the time he returned north, Harald was rich, feared, and battle-hardened. He had gained the nickname Hardrada, meaning hard ruler. He was no longer the boy who had fled Norway. He was a warrior king in waiting. In 1046, Harald returned to Norway and seized the throne, ruling first as co-king, then as sole monarch, after eliminating his rival. For 2 decades, Harald ruled with force and ambition. He strengthened royal authority, crushed rebellious jarls, and built a centralised kingdom. He launched raids into Denmark, tried to reclaim lost territory, and maintained a vast network of alliances and mercenaries. Under his rule, Norway grew in strength and wealth, and so did Harald's appetite for more. In 1066, Harald saw his chance. England was in turmoil after the death of King Edward the Confessor. Harald claimed the English throne, arguing that an earlier agreement gave him the right to rule. He launched an invasion with over 10,000 warriors and 300 ships. He crushed local forces at the Battle of Fulford, taking the city of York. But just days later, he was ambushed at Stamford Bridge by King Harold Godwinson. Vikings, unprepared and outnumbered, fought with legendary ferocity. Harold, towering, armoured, wielding a massive 2-handed sword, fought like the old gods were watching, but a fatal arrow pierced his neck. Harald Hardrada fell, and with him, the Viking Age ended. Harold's invasion failed, but his legacy endured. He was the last true Viking king, a man who embodied the spirit of Norse ambition, adventure, and defiance. His death marked the final Viking assault on England. But Harald had already etched his saga in steel, from exile to Emperor's Guard, from battlefields of Byzantium to the blood-soaked hills of England. Harald Hardrada died as he lived, fighting, leading, unyielding. These 6 leaders were more than raiders. They were kings, settlers, explorers, and visionaries. The Viking world was forged not just with axes, but with minds bold enough to change the course of history. Their stories echo through time, etched in sagas, stone, and the lands they once claimed. These were the leaders who shaped the North, and their legacy still sails with us today.